Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard and welcome to the Tournament Tactician Magical Misadventures Seasonal Tournament Edition of the tier list. This is the finalized version, and we're just going to be doing our normal thing, going over this one a lot more in-depth than a more traditional one, because this is the big seasonal edition. I want you to be well prepared, and what I'm really looking to do here is help you solidify some of the decisions that you have made. Maybe if you're teetering on what your third deck should be, maybe I can sell you on one a little bit better than the other. There's still a little bit of time left if you do want to have big balls and pull a complete 180 on your lineup. That's totally up to you. I don't recommend it, but you're not always here to follow my recommendations. Sometimes you're here to figure out what the average player is thinking and sort of counter that or go from there. Go the complete opposite of what I say. You know, it's all up to you at the end of the day. All I can do is try and impart the wisdom onto you that I have gained over the last 4 weeks of analyzing the meta. Now, the first thing you're going to notice here is that there's a shit ton of decks. I think it's 24, 26 decks, something like that. Not every deck that tops the seasonal is on this tier list. The Beyond the Bandlewood seasonals have been some of the most diverse that we've ever had, and every week, in just looking at 2 top 8s from grassroots tournaments, we've consistently had 20 plus decks. So I've tried to consolidate things as best I can. Now, the Dark Horse section is something that we don't have on the normal Tournament Tactician tier list. Generally, my baseline here is anything that is tier 3 can still win a tournament. I don't want you to look at those and say, okay, these are the bad options. They are still very much options. They just might not be popular, or they might be a little bit niche. The Dark Horse section is for decks that I don't necessarily think could win a tournament, but you're not trying to win a tournament here. You're trying to go 7-2, you're trying to go 8-1, you're trying to go 9-0, and then change your lineup into a more specialized version actually going into the top 32. So the Dark Horse section are decks that I want you to be aware of that you very feasibly could run into, because at the end of the day, what this video is about is just giving you the knowledge that I have, and this is knowledge that I have that I feel is pertinent towards your success in the seasonal. Maybe you like one of these decks. Maybe I say something about it that really strikes you and you want to put it in your lineup. That's all totally up to you, but let's actually get into the tier list. So I'm expecting a baseline knowledge of you here on the competitive Runeterra scene. I'm not going to be explaining what these decks do in depth, but kicking things off, we have Ari Kennan in tier 1, to the surprise of nobody. This is the best deck in the game, not debatable, not even close to debate, and it is, like most best decks before it, a hot topic on whether or not you should be banning this or leaving it open and looking to soft counter it. I am of the opinion that you should be banning it, as I have been for most best decks in the past. The one little piece of advice that I can give is if you are looking to leave it open, then you should be on the go hard version if you are running your own variant, as it does help a little bit more in the mirror. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter which version of these you run. I don't think anyone is bringing the Absolver version and going, oh man, if I had just brought the go hard version, I would have topped. But as much as the splash impacts the way that you're going to play the deck, so does the number of 6 drops, with the main difference, the standardized streamlined versions being Absolver is on 1 sign-in, Relentless Pursuit is on 2 sign-in and 1 scattered pod, and Go Hard is on 3 sign-in. So it really does just come down to a comfort. You know, do you like one of these splashes more? They're all playing most of the same main deck cards, so it is just going to come down to how much do you like or not like that 6 drop. Maybe you really like what the life steal from Go Hard is bringing to the table, but at the end of the day, it is up to you. I'm not really leaning hard on one of these or the other. I think all of them are completely viable. Getting down to Pantheon, this is where things get interesting, because the decks Shyvana and Taric, the 2 variants, are very much 50-50 on which ones players are bringing to tournaments, but the Taric one has like 3 matchups that it swings heavily back into its favor that the Shyvana version does not have. I'm talking like 35% win rate to a close to 50, Lurk being the main one, and Shyvana doesn't really have any matchups that it swings back in a big way from the Taric variant. It's going to come down to comfort, because these 2 decks do play rather differently. The Shyvana version is playing for the board a little bit more. You're using your Fury procs from your dragons. You get to play more combat tricks as your splash options, like Strafing Strike is going to be better. Judgment would fit into this deck a little bit more organically. And Pantheon Taric is having more explosive finishes. It's racing a little bit better because of those double rallies from the Golden Ages onto the Taric. Pantheon Shyvana feels like it plays better if you don't draw any champions, and part of that is just 1, Screeching Dragon being a mid-range pillar option that Pantheon Taric doesn't necessarily have, and 2 is Dragon's Clutch. You know, you do actually have more consistent access to your champions, but again, it is just going to come down to comfort. I fully believe that if you are on the Pantheon Shyvana version, you will have just as much success as you do on the Taric version, unless you run into somebody who came to counter the like they looked at the matchup charts and said, oh, there are 3 decks that Shyvana gets hosed by, the Taric doesn't get hosed by. I'm just bringing those 3 decks and looking to hose the Shyvana version. I don't think it should be that big of a deal, but it is a bigger deal which Pantheon version you bring than which Ari Kennan version you bring. And then rounding out, we have Lee Sin. Lee Sin's the most consistent, best deck in Legends of Runeterra. It has topped every single seasonal. It is the only deck that has topped every single seasonal. It is currently back on track to be a top 3 deck this weekend. I think it's pretty clear cut that the top 3 decks are going to be Ari Kennan, followed by Pantheon, followed by Lee Sin when we're looking at the top 32 breakdown. That's really not a hot take. That's more so just like that is what the data is pointing towards. That's a very realistic top 3. Top 4, top 5, we can debate a little bit more, but these are pretty much sold as the top 3 decks that are going to be putting players into the top 32. And this is, I think, probably one of the best lineups. Just Ari Kennan, Pantheon, and Lee Sin. It's what Drissoth took to the online league series a couple weeks ago. We've seen a couple copycats since then. All of them have had great success. I say as we only check the top cuts, so we only see the players that brought it and topped with it. But the point stands, this is one of my favorite lineups. This is probably what I'd be bringing. Are you susceptible to the players that think you can counter you? Yes, this is a little bit of a skill check in saying, I don't think you can actually beat Ari Kennan X. I don't think you guys can actually beat the Pantheon in the way that you think you can. I'm willing to just bring these decks and show you up with my player skill. I think that's about as close as we're going to get to an XYZ lineup, but we don't really have one of those in a concrete manner, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Tier 2 is the Wild West. If you took 50 players and you made them all make tournament tier lists, I think there's a decent shot that nobody's tier 2 would look exactly the same. You certainly wouldn't have a general consensus on it, because generally what you do is you take a look at the top performers in the meta, you pick a cutoff where you feel the power level drops off. That's tier 1, that's tier 2, pick another cutoff, that's where tier 3 is. And Ari Kennan and Pantheon have been the only consistent decks from day one. Lee Sin is consistently number 3 since it's made its resurgence in the meta, and nothing has consistently taken the number 4 spot or the number 5 spot or anything like that. Sivir Demacia has had some bad weeks. Yordles and Arms has had some bad weeks, but I think they're still very solid options. I think that they are solitaire enough game plans that taking them into a very open field is something that I am interested in doing and something that I would encourage players to do, Yordles and Arms especially. Iceborn Spiders is sticking up here because it is my favorite Shadow Isle Freljord control deck at the moment. Its matchup charts are actually pretty insane because it can either attack you on this aggressive spider front or it can play the control game. Now, it doesn't have the sweepers that you find in something like Field of Rush. It's not really running as many Avalanches and Blighted Ravines. Those are both completely optional. I personally like Blighted Ravine in the deck, but I think that it's got enough different attack points that your opponent has to be very wary of playing the game incorrectly, even in an open deck list format. Now, obviously, you're going to run into games where you don't draw Iceborn Legacy, and I've seen some versions that are at least Kindred, which does intrigue me because all of a sudden, you know, it's okay, well, if I don't draw Iceborn Legacy, maybe Kindred can hold the game down a little bit, and Trundle will do that in a similar fashion, but I do still think that, like, you need Elise for, okay, well, I didn't draw Iceborn Legacy or Kindred, but I drew Elise and Brood Awakening, and sometimes that's all I actually need in order to maybe even just smork down my opponent until we sit here and fight for board until I get a Ladros down. I think that the deck is consistent, and because it attacks on so many different fronts, I think it's a really cool deck, a really versatile choice, one that I'm a big fan of. Spider Aggro. Oh, Finny. Finny really threw a wrench in the works here of the Legends of Runeterra competitive scene by picking up a win at the Mastering Runeterra $5,000 championship with Spiders, Pirates, and AKX. I have been a long-time hater of triple aggro decks in seasonal open rounds, and I will continue to do that for this seasonal, but AKX is not an aggro deck, and double aggro does have a much higher consistency rate than triple aggro, and I think that, like, Kennan Go Hard, Elise, and Pirates is going to be a pretty standardized lineup for players that are looking to bring aggro, and they don't even necessarily have to know how to play their Ari Kennan because they are aware of the fact that a lot of players are going to be looking to ban it, and maybe they just want to play Spiders and Pirates. Now, Draven Rumble does slip into the mix a little bit. I think Thomas OW did pick up a win at EMEA Fight Night with Draven Rumble as well as the Spider deck and the AK, going for the Absolver version of that deck as well instead of the Go Hard version because, I don't know, just comfort, I guess, but yeah, Spiders is really, I don't know that it's, like, great. Again, this is where, like, sort of the cutoff comes in, the drop in power level from tier 1. But I think that you will see it. You need to be prepared for it. You cannot ignore it in the way that you have been able to ignore aggro in previous seasonals. I think that you will run into it a couple of times. And it's definitely something that you need to be cognizant of, and the Spider deck is the one that is going to beat your ass harder than the other aggro deck. Like, if it comes down to it and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to leave the Ari Kennan open, that was my original strategy, Spiders is probably the deck that you're banning rather than either the Draven Rumble or the Pirates. And then Darkness. I've had Darkness in tier 1 for a couple seasonals. I still think that Darkness is a very good deck if you're a good player on it. My concern is that, like, I think there's a small chance that Darkness is going to fold to the open meta in a way that it hasn't necessarily had to in previous seasonals. I think that if you played 100 games of Darkness, you would lose 2 or 3 more than you would in previous seasonals if you're just playing, like, every open round player in a round robin style or something along those lines. So there's a chance it's going to catch up to you. There's a chance that it's not. But also, Ari Kennan players have adapted to playing against darkness. They sort of figured it out. You're not doing phenomenally into Pantheon either. I think that like your matchups into the top end are not as good as you want them to be to bring darkness as an enticing option. Now, Jay Tamanda's probably still going to top with darkness, but Jay Tamanda's probably bringing darkness, lurk, and Viego as he has for the last couple of tournaments, and he's probably going to top cut because he's just one of the best players on the Americas server, and I wouldn't necessarily use that success as an indicator that darkness is this phenomenal deck, because I don't think lurk is a phenomenal deck. I don't necessarily know that Spooky Viego is a phenomenal deck. I've been big on it for a while. I'm a little bit less on it this week, but I think that's just a Jay Tamanda diff. You can't really use him as the deciding factor of, okay, yeah, darkness is a tier 1 deck, because I don't think you're going to put more than, I would say no more than 5 players top this seasonal with darkness. I think it's going to be, because last season, I think it was only 6 or 7. I would definitely say it's going to be less this seasonal than last seasonal, but I do still think that it is like definitely one of the more solid control decks out there. Something that a lot of players used in the early stages as the Z of their Ari Kennan and Pantheon lineup, and maybe it'll be the Z again, especially with Lee Sin coming back into the meta. But there are definitely players out there who are looking to counter Lee Sin with landmark-based win cons, and darkness is going to catch flack for that. Tier 3, we kind of get lost in the weeds. There's a lot of decks that are down here that are hard to articulate what kind of lineup they're going to be in. Some of them, like landmarks, are going to be more specialized and do better in a top 32 meta than they would in the open meta, but they are still going to find success in the open meta. Lurk is in here because I want you to be aware of its existence, not necessarily because I think it's a good deck, but it'll probably put some players in the top 32. Lurk might even be... I'd be surprised if Lurk was a top 5 deck. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a top 10 deck, but I'd be surprised if it was top 5. Thralls, I found out today that the Thralls list hasn't actually changed in 2 months, but we're still seeing like at least 1 to 2 of them in just about every tournament. Draven Rumble, of course, being an alternative to Pirates, Pirates being Pirates, and then Iceborn Poros coming back as a way to counteract the slow decks, as well as Iceborn Poros and Iceborn Spiders picking up some play rates in the last week. And Iceborn Poros specifically is just like won 3 tournaments in the last 4 weeks, and has had almost no top cuts other than those 3 wins specifically. It's like in either first places or it just doesn't top, and that is just how Iceborn Pros has been functioning. Talking about bringing it for the open rounds, it does feel pretty risky, especially with the resurgence of aggro, because Iceborn Poros doesn't play defense very well. You really have to hit some decent draws to try and race something like Spiders or Pirates, something that's a lot more burn-oriented that has the decimates available, but it's still like an option. And then Dark Horses. These are just decks that like I want you to be aware of, like Elusive Rally. It's been a while since we saw it, has really fallen to the wayside for something like Yordles and Arms, but it's not out of the question for somebody to have this. These are very much more decks that like I just want you to be aware of their existence and their functionality. Landmark Aggro, I think, is one that is actually really cool that we could see as sort of this actual like Dark Horse deck to come out. Maybe a couple of the Brazilian players bring it. It's Ziggs Talia. It's like a more aggro version of Zillion Zareth. Nami Twisted Fate. This is a deck that I don't know how to quantify. It hasn't done anything in tournaments, but I know 4LW just went on a hot streak with it in Masters, and 4LW is a very high-profile player right now. A lot of eyes are on him, as well as some other top teams have been discussing the deck, but haven't actually brought it to a tournament. Maybe it's been their secret spice to break out for the seasonal. It is something that I want you to be aware of. I don't really have any data on it or like where it's going to fit into a lineup. Feel the Mina as an alternative to Feel the Rush is something that like Majin Bay and Kevor seem to be relatively big fans of. So like, you know, just the Ionia players do have an FTR deck that they might end up bringing. Starspring. Sir Termund is gonna top the seasonal with Starspring. At the very least, Starspring will come out in the top 32, but I don't really expect it to do well in the open rounds. But again, I never expect it to do well in the open rounds. But anytime that Lee Sin is back in the meta, we do have to talk about Starspring. Similarly, Scouts. Scouts is kind of like getting bodied by every mid-range deck and then beating the slower decks and doing like okay against aggro. It's Scouts, the same as always been. And then Sentinel Control has just fallen off so spectacularly, but I did want to mention that, like, hey, you know, this does still exist. If somebody could bring it in their lineup, I'm not necessarily expecting it, but with the resurgence of Spiders in the last second, it's not completely impossible. So stepping away from the tier list here for a second, I want to talk about lineups. Now, as cheesy as it is, there's 2 main lineups. There's AK lineups and non-AK lineups, and then these break down into a couple of different subgroups. The main Ari Kennan lineups are going to be Pantheon plus Z, And the Z for the Pantheon is completely random. It could literally be anything. Ari Kennan Pantheon and whatever the third deck is just completely up to whatever the player wants to bring. And what concerns me a lot about players wanting to leave open Ari Kennan and ban Pantheon is that with no uniformity on the Z, you could really be running into anything. And I don't think anyone is really under the delusion that if they are looking to soft counter Ari Kennan, that they're going to be 2-0ing Ari Kennan every time. I think they are hoping for at best a 1-0, and that means you do have to beat the Z deck. And if it is something that beats whatever your third deck is, like, you could just have a complete mismatch on your Z deck versus your opponent's Z deck, and that is just going to completely decide your match. And that is not something that I necessarily recommend doing, which is part of the reason that I'm on the ban AK plan. The other ones, mostly, are going to be AK and Lee Sin plus Z, but the Z is usually control. Now, for what it's worth, those three decks are a pretty popular lineup. AK Pantheon Lee was the most popular lineup last weekend, but outside of specifically AK Pantheon Lee, Lee Sin is being paired with Control more often than it is being paired with any other kind of deck. So if you are looking to, talk about these Lee Sin lineups, what they are looking for 100% of the time thus far is either Ari Kennan and Pantheon or a Control deck and Ari Kennan. So if you are looking to talk about, I might want to soft target Lee Sin, you have a general idea of the lineup that it's going to be fit into. Now, this is obviously not a perfect translation into what it's going to be because it's a 1,000 fucking player tournament. Not everyone's going to be this, but for the most part, the theory is sound. And if you want to go off of this theory, then I encourage you to do so because it is what is currently backed by the data, as much as that doesn't directly translate into this. But if you're just looking for some level of comfort, some semblance of, hey, what do Lee Sin players think? This is where things have been looking. And that Control deck can really be anything. It could be Darkness, it could be Field of Mina, it could be Iceborn Spiders. That one's really up in the air, but for the most part, it is going to be another slower deck. The non-AK lineups are a little bit less uniform. It's a bit of a coin flip on what these players are actually going to be bringing, because there's two different kinds of non-AK players. There are people who think that AK is counterable, but also do not have the balls to counter AK, and then you have good players bringing random shit. So, for an example of like I think that Ari Kennan is beatable, but I'm too scared to try and counter it, so I'm going to ban it, is we have like Pantheon plus like mid-range. Usually you'll see like Pantheon plus Yordles in Arms plus a third deck. Like Pantheon, Yordles in Arms, and Lurk, I think is a pretty reasonable lineup, but it's also one that I haven't actually seen. Like, nobody that I've seen playing Lurk is playing it alongside Pantheon and Yordles in Arms, but these are the kinds of decks that are going to go into the non-AK lineup. I think usually the non-AK lineups are people that are like looking to ban, or like just 3-deck beat Pantheon or something along those lines. It's a little hard to make heads or tails of. I'm not completely sold on it, especially because like Lurk does so... Lurk still beats Taric Pantheon. It's nowhere near as favored as it is into Shyvana, but it is still very slightly favored. But that's like one sample lineup, just to give you an idea of what the non-AK players are going for. And, if you're on like this, okay, I'm going to pick on the AK, I want to know what these other lineups look like. These are kind of what we're going for. Then, of course, you have triple aggro. I don't actually expect a lot of triple aggro, and triple aggro is almost certainly going to be Spiders, Pirates, and Rumble. Maybe they'll throw scouts in there, but these are the 3 burn decks that players are going on to try and counter the AK and things of that nature. And then we have good players running random shit. The two that are sticking out to me the most as having done consistently well with similar lineups over the course of the season is like Jay Tamanda, who plays a lot of Lurk, Viego, Darkness, and Italian X, who plays a lot of like landmarks, and then like Lux. Like Italian X has played a lot of like Talia, Malphite, Zillion, Zareth, and then Jace Lux. Like it is a complete Wild West on good players bringing random shit, and I'm sure that some bad players will bring random shit as well. But there are like even if you're like, oh yeah, I only have to watch out for like one good player, they could just be on some complete nonsense. I wouldn't be surprised if these are the lineups that like Jay Tamanda and Italian X are bringing into the seasonal, just because like these are what they've been playing over the last couple of weeks, and they've had a lot of success with it. Which is to say, it's a crapshoot, baby. I don't know why they're bringing these decks. I don't know what the cohesive glue is that holds them all together. I have to think it's just player diff. But essentially what I'm trying to get at here is that like you really can't make heads or tails of what kind of lineups you're going to be running into, because even if this is like a 1% lineup, there is still the chance that like it is one of your rounds. That's maybe you lose to that because your decks are completely unprepared for that. All of a sudden you're in the 8-1 bracket. If you can't hold a 7-2 and you ever falter against AK, you're in for a rough time. So what I'm trying to get at here is scaring you, because there's really no way to make heads or tails of this. There is no objectively correct lineup. There is no objectively correct counter pick to bring. Things are all over the place, and these are the different kinds of things that have been having success. You can get a little bit specific with the kinds of AK lineups that you're going to see. There's not actually a lot of times that we're seeing like AK and then X and X. Like, people aren't really bringing AK and then like 2 random decks. Obviously, like AK and Spiders and Pirates is still a lineup, or AK and Spiders and Rumble. So like maybe AK aggro, but for the most part, the AK lineups are either Pantheon plus Z or Lee Sin plus Control, and sometimes, more often than not, like Pantheon Lee or just all together, because those are just like the 3 best decks in the game. So like, if you're looking to skill gap people, if you're looking for a safe lineup, if you're like, hey, I'm just the better player, then AK Pantheon Lee is a great choice for you. AK aggro is a choice for players who are maybe not as confident in their skill level, or maybe they disrespect Ari Kennan. They think that, you know, everybody's gotten soft, it's been banned so many times that players aren't even testing it anymore. They're going to fumble on the deck, and unless you play Ari Kennan perfectly, then you're probably not going to beat these aggro players. So I can come in and target the players that have gotten a little bit lazy in their testing, especially in the Americas, because that is sort of what we're known for in esports in general, is getting lazy in our testing, is what it is. And you'll also do okay into Lee Sin plus Control. It really depends on the flavor of Control, because some are more exploitable by aggro than others. And then, like, you probably will run into some kind of, like, Landmark, Lux lineup. Not specifically Tilium, Malphite, Zillion, Xerath, and Lux, but, like, Starspring and Bandle Tree, or, like, Thralls and, you know, whatever. Like, there's a lot of different Landmark decks that are out there. These are the ones that are going to be, like, your nightmare if you're trying to play Control. But ultimately, like, the best I can do without trying to mix up words and say level 1 and level 0 and 16 different kinds of terminology is just like, this is the picture as it stands. This is the best that I can do for you, is pointing out these trends that I have noticed, and you will have to do with that information what you will. But I do think that this will be one of the most solid lineups, something that a lot of players are going to default to, because there are a lot of top-tier Lee Sin players on the America Shard. And hopefully that this information stands out to you in some way and helps you a little bit. But that's just, those are the trends that I've noticed. I haven't gone too deep into how to counteract those, but that is, I just wanted to present this information to you and call it a day there. And that's actually, I think that's going to do it for me on the Tournament Tactician Seasonal Edition. This isn't as long as some of the other ones, but part of that is just due to the large unknown factor of the meta, and I don't want to sit here and either, like, sell you on something that isn't true by talking out of my ass and just talking for the sake of talking. But again, I hope you got something helpful out of this. I know I got a little unhinged there and repeated myself a few times during the lineup portion. Part of that is I don't normally do it, but I do hope that that was at least a little bit helpful in terms of figuring out what the field is going to look like a little bit more. There are a lot of decks where, like, Lurk, I don't know exactly what kind of, like, lineups Lurk is fitting into, because the only player that has been having consistent success with it is Jay Tamanda, who is bringing, like, it alongside Darkness and Viego, which I don't think is a replicatable lineup, but it's all just a matter of comfort at this point. You know, it is what it is. And I am very glad to be a caster at this time rather than a player, because I wouldn't know where to make heads or tails of this meta. I would probably just bring Ari Kennan, Lee Sin, and Pantheon and try to skill gap people, but that's just the kind of player that I am when I play card games competitively, is that I'm just looking for the skill gap. You know, if you don't misplay, it's hard to lose. These are decks that will beat the other decks if you don't misplay as often. That said, I do have preferences. If I were playing, I'd be on the Relentless Pursuit version of Ari Kennan. I'm a bigger fan of Pantheon Taric as well. Might throw in a tech card or two, probably not. Probably just play like standard versions of Lee Sin, Zoe, Pantheon Taric, and AK Relentless Pursuit. Maybe swap it up for Top Cut, but that's something that I will talk about next week. So, thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard. I hope that you can try to feel some semblance of confidence when you go to sleep Friday night going into this event. But thank you so much for watching. Good luck in the seasonal. Also, if you are looking for some additional information, you just want to read as much as possible about this format, I do have an article that got published today by Giant Slayer on the competitive wrap-up for the last week of tournaments, so a little bit more information in that. A lot of it was covered in this video already, but, you know, if you just want to double down, read some of it, because there's obviously things that I said in there that I didn't say in here, feel free to do that. And follow me on Twitter, @casterboulevard. So, thank you so much for watching.